The metaphysical poets. The metaphysical poetry may be classified into two broad divisions of amorous and religious verse. The former was written largely by courtly poets, Carew, Suckling, etc., and the latter by Herbert Crashaw and Vaughan. The metaphysical element, it seems, first made its appearance in love poems written after the Italian pattern, which Donne adopted as his models. The metaphysicals of the 17th century, says H. J. C. Gearson, combined two things: the fantastic dialectics of medieval love poetry and simple sensuous strain caught from the classics. John Donne, 1537 to 1631. Donne, the founder of the metaphysical school of poetry, is the greatest poet of his school. He was a great scholar and a theologian, but his clandestine marriage, he was imprisoned. For his clandestine marriage, he was imprisoned, and on writing to his wife, subscribed his letter John Donne, and Donne undone. His famous works are the Pseudo-Martyr, 1610, the Progress of the Soul, 1601, An Anatomy of the World, an Elegy, 1611, and an Elegy, An Anatomy of the World, an Elegy, 1611, Epithalamium, 1613, and Satires, Songs and Sonnets, elegies which are published posthumously about 1633. His poetry falls naturally into three divisions. Amorous poetry. Donne's love poetry was written in his brilliant and turbulent youth. His songs and sonnets is a collection of love poems which are intense and subtle analysis of all the moods of a lover, expressed in vivid and startling language, which is colloquial rather than conventional. An undercurrent of satire runs even in his love poetry. His best known love poems are Air and the Angels and Nocturnal upon S. Lewis's Day, a valedictorian for valediction, forbidding mourning and ecstasy. Donne is especially a psychological poet whose primary concern is feeling. His poems are intensely personal and reveal a power of and complex being. Number 2, religious poetry. Donne's religious poetry was written after 1610. Holy sonnets and desires such as a hymn to God the Father are the finest religious poems. His hymn to God the Father are his finest religious poems. His religious and devotional prayers are in the form of a confession of or prayer. Number 3, satirical poems. Donne wrote satires such as that of the Progress of the Soul, 1600, reveal his cynical nature and keenly the critical mind. They show his They showed his dissatisfaction with the world around him. They were written in the couplet form, which was later adopted by Dryden and Cooper and Pope. Dryden said about Donne, He affects the metaphysics. The term metaphysical is applied to Donne and the group of poets who follow him. The word metaphysical strictly means based on general reasoning, but Donne's poetry shows more than this. In the words of Elizabeth Albert, but Donne's poetry shows more than this. In the words of Elizabeth Albert, it reveals a depth of philosophy, a subtlety of reasoning, a blend of thought and wisdom, a blend of thought and devotion, a mingling of the whole and the sublime, the light and the serious, which make it full of variety and surprise. End of page 107, now page 108. Donne's poetry is scholarly. His images are far-fetched, obscure, unusual and striking. For example, page number 108. Donne's poetry is scholarly. His images are far-fetched, obscure, unusual and striking. For example, so doth each tear which thee doth wear, a globe hereward that impression grow, till they tears mixed with mine do overflow. This world by waters sent from thee, my heavens dissolved so. Donne immensely influenced both the courtly and the religious poetry of the 17th century. All the metaphysical poets show directly or indirectly Donne's influence. George Herbert, 1593 to 1633. Herbert, whose poems were collected in the Temple of 1633, is a religious poet who showed an ardent interest in the Church of England. His poetry is distinguished by clarity of expression, concrete imagery, and intelligible conceits. He preferred simple, homely, racy language and naturalness of expression. For example, he that forbears to suit and serve his need serves his lord, but as I rather have had, and grew more fierce and wild at every word. Methought I heard the calling's child, and I replied, my lord. Number 4. Richard Crawshaw, Crawshaw, between 1613 to 1649. Crawshaw's best work, Steps to the Temple, 1646, is both secular and religious. His poetry is noticeable for striking and fantastic conceits and religious fire and fervor. It is emotional and not thoughtful. It is mainly lyrical. Number 5. Henry Vaughan, 1622 to 1695. Vaughan's work includes poems Olor Iscanus, Silex Scintillans. Henry Vaughan, number 5, 1622 to 1695. Vaughan's work includes poems 1646, Olor Iscanus, 1657, Silex Scintillans, 1650, and Thalia Rediviva, 1678. He is a mystic at heart. His poems, which are religious in nature, are conspicuous for fantasy, intellectual power and originality. Edward Albert writes, His regard for natures, moreover, has a closeness and penetration that sometimes suggests Wordsworth. Number 6. Thomas Carew, 1594 to 1639. Carew reveals undoubted lyrical ability in poems 1640. All his poetry is the work of an amorist whose richness of fancy, lyrical spontaneity, and golden felicity of diction are superb. For example, ask me no more if east or west the phoenix builds its spicy nest, for unto you at last she flies, and on your fragrant blossom dies. His style and versification are so polished and refined that he anticipates Waller and Denham. Number 7. Abraham Cowley, 1618 to 1667. Cowley, a distinguished classical scholar, was a man of versatile literary interests. He successfully wrote poems, essays, plays, and history. He wrote an epical romance, Pyramus and Thisbe, at the age of 10, and 2 years later he wrote Constantia and Philatus. His well-known poems are The Mistress, the Davideis, and the Pindaric Odes. He is an important transitional poet of this period. He is considered to be the last of the metaphysical poets and a true disciple of Donne. With all his piety, his fancy, his conceits, and his Pindarism, Cowley is the first of all an intellectual. His lyrics are often sweet and graceful. Number 8. King Henry King, 1592 to 1669. As a poet, he has no slight share of Donne's subtlety, though little of his strength. He wrote several beautiful love songs. Among them, "Tell Me No More, How Fair She Was" was very popular. The contribution of the metaphysical poets to English literature. Number 1. The metaphysical poets have given to the English language its best religious poetry. The moods of incisive introspection and mysticism could best be expressed not through commonplace, conventional poetic images and language, but unconventional and bold imagery which would jolt the mind and spirit of the reader into an intimate rapport with the mood of the poet. Herbert, Donne, Vaughan, Crashaw, and Traherne are the most important among the religious English poets of all ages. Number 2. In the field of love poetry too, the contribution of the metaphysicals is considerable and quite important from the historical point of view. When Donne appeared on the stage, Spenser and his followers were following the Petrarchan tradition of highly sentimental and idealized love poetry, which had not much to do with reality. Donne demolished this claptrap and started a vein of highly realistic, frankly sensual, and sometimes downright cynical amatory verse. He was critical of the Elizabethan sonneteers and lyricists who put their mistresses, real or imaginary, on the pedestal of deity and pretended to woo them as their servants, dying or living in accordance with their moods or rejection or acceptance of their supplications. Donne was frank enough. End of page 108, now page 109. Love, not so pure and abstract as they use, to say which have no mistress but their muse, love sometimes would, contemplate sometimes do. Number 3. Even in the ruggedness and occasional vulgarity of their diction and versification, the metaphysicals did some service to English poetry in that they made the poets realize that the smoothness of numbers alone does not make the great numbers does not make for great poetry. What was needed was a hard core of sense and deft handling of the experience related to the poet himself, who reserved for himself the liberty to employ whatever diction and style he thought was eminently suitable for his purpose. After Donne and his followers, the mere music of poetry could not capture for it any appreciative audience. Number 4. The intellectualism of the metaphysical poetry and the compositeness of its imagery and even the crabbed nature of its style secured for it a continuous stream of readers from generation to generation. In the modern times, all these qualities appear agreeable to a large number of readers. The modern poets, particularly T.S. Eliot, living in an age of crumbling values, like the age of Donne, have found a guide and a source of inspiration in Donne. It is not surprising then that in the modern critical canon, Donne is rated as one of the best English poets. The Puritan Age. Social background. The first half of the 17th century is known as the Puritan Age. Puritanism was the dominant force during this period. It is also called the Age of Milton, for Milton was the greatest poet of this period. As first King James I and then Charles I ruled England during these years, it is also referred to the Jacobean Age, adjective from James, or the Caroline Age, adjective from Charles. It is an age of transition. By this time, the Renaissance impulse had exhausted itself. The Elizabethan zest for life was gone, and the Elizabethan exuberance and optimism had been succeeded by a mood of apprehension, disillusionment, and defeat. A. Political. There are various causes which gave rise to this pessimism, despondency and anxiety. There were, first of all, the political causes. There was a widespread feeling of uncertainty and instability in the later years of the reign of Elizabeth. This was caused mainly by the memory of the crisis caused in the past on 3 occasions by the question of accession and the series of plots to assassinate the Queen throughout her reign. This, combined with the knowledge that there was no obvious heir to the throne at her death, caused a sense of insecurity and uncertainty. The threats of invasion by the Catholic power of Spain, culminating in the Armada invasion of 1588, was still fresh in men's memories, as was the knowledge that Pope Pius V had exempted Elizabeth's Catholic subjects from their oath of allegiance in 1570. The larger number of her possible successors, James of Scotland, Lady Arabella Stuart, certain English nobles of royal blood, various foreign princes, particularly the Infanta of Spain and lately Essex himself, the more likelihood was there of civil war breaking out at her death and of the intervention of some foreign power. The situation reached its crisis in the rebellion of the Earl of Essex in February 7, 1601. The feeling of insecurity thus caused was to some degree elevated by his defeat and execution, but the shock of the fall of so great and brilliant a figure had in itself an impact second only to the relief at the collapse of the political menace. By the following year, 1602, it was generally recognized that James Stuart of Scotland was the probable heir. The second period of relief that followed his accession to the throne in 1603 gave way almost at once to a feeling of uncertainty and danger, even greater than of the last years of Elizabeth. His personal unpopularity was as a sovereign went a long way to bring this about. The lowering of standards in the court was immediate. Slackness of discipline, loss of dignity, and increase in expenditure combined to produce at once dissatisfaction and a feeling of instability. Plots to depose him broke out almost at once. Cobham's in November 1603 involved Raleigh, a man who still represented the Elizabethans in the eyes of some of the contemporaries, and the gunpowder plot in 1605, which only just missed its mark, would have left the country deprived at low ebb of all its leaders, temporal and ecclesiastical, and all the machinery of the state. The constant plotting of the Jesuits against James went on for some time, even after the failure of the plot in 1605. End of page 109. Now page 110. Be religious. Rise of Puritanism. Such were the political reasons which led to the mood of the misgiving, apprehension, and uncertainty which spread throughout the thinking world and was reflected with the particular clearness in the drama. Besides these political causes, there were religious causes also for this mood of fear and anxiety which overtook the nation during the early years of the 17th century. It was during this period that Puritanism emerged as a great controlling moral and good social force. In the broadest sense, Puritanism may be regarded as the renaissance of the moral sense of man. The Greco-Roman Renaissance of 15th and 16th centuries has largely pagan and sensuous. It did not touch the moral nature of man. It did nothing for his religious, political, and social emancipation. The Puritan movement, on the other hand, was the greatest movement for moral and political reform. It aims for one, religious liberty, that is, men should be free to worship according to their conscience, and second, that they should enjoy full civil liberty. The Puritans wanted them to make the men honest and make the men honest, and to make them free. They insisted on the purity of life.